I'm in a bad versus good mood today, so get ready to talk about character introductions. By the way, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm the author of Bad Parts, also the author of Entry Wounds, and welcome to my writing channel. Just like in real life, first impressions are critical to a story's characters. And when it comes to introducing characters, there are right and wrong ways of doing it. And that's what we'll be discussing today. First, we'll talk about what makes for a good character intro. Then we'll look at 4 specific types of bad intros. And for each type, I'll give you a bad example from a movie, then I'll give you a good example, and we'll analyze both. Alright, now let's start by answering the question, what makes a good character introduction? And obviously a character intro should engage us, it should make us want more, but I came up with some specific tips that can help you craft a good intro. And the first one is to establish an emotional connection. And this is critical. Your audience will only care about your story if they care about your characters. Now, how do you build an emotional connection? Well, there are 3 different ways. The first one is to create sympathy. Make us feel sorry for the character. Show them experiencing great suffering, whether it's physical or emotional. Now, the second way is to create empathy. Make us understand the character. We don't necessarily have to like the character from the start, but if we understand who they are and why they do the things they do, we can relate to them. And then the third way is to create envy. Make us want to step into the character's shoes. And this especially works well with characters who are skilled, powerful, wealthy, or stylish. Most audiences yearn to live a more exciting life, and they feel drawn to exciting characters. The second tip for writing a good character intro is to give us a sense of intrigue or mystery. And if a character is introduced as being mysterious, we will want to know about the character's motives and backstory. We'll be compelled to follow this character until our burning questions are answered. Third tip is to give us a glimpse of their daily life. Show us who your character is right now. What job do they perform? What skills do they have? What kind of environment do they exist in? In most cases, you'll want to show your character on the job, but you can also show them in a family setting or in other significant situations. Fourth tip, include conflict in your intro. And the conflict can be an external threat or an internal dilemma. Either way, if your character faces obstacles in their intro scene, we get to see how they respond to pressure. Maybe they're naturally good at facing conflict, or maybe they have room to grow in this regard. Fifth tip is to inject style into the intro. Your character's appearance, attitude, and speaking style all tell us valuable things about who they are. And then the 6th and final tip is to make sure your intro delivers the appropriate amount of impact. Major characters deserve significant, meaningful intros. But on the other hand, minor characters and stock characters shouldn't receive the same level of attention. Okay, now let's look at some bad types of character intros. What I'm going to do, I have 4 types. I'll explain what each type is, then I'll give you a bad example, I'll explain why it sucks, and then I'll give you a good example of the type, and I'll explain why it works. The first type of bad character introduction is the significant nobody. And this is when an unimportant character is given a memorable or intriguing intro scene. And typically this involves stock characters who don't factor into the plot in any meaningful way. You might have a random bartender, cashier, or cab driver who gets a fancy intro scene. They're made to look like an important character, but instead they just disappear afterwards. And it's a case of having a setup without a meaningful payoff. You shine a spotlight on someone who doesn't deserve the spotlight. And these intros are a problem because they can disappoint or confuse your audience. They raise expectations for no good reason. For a bad example, let's look at Addie the bartender from John Wick. Now, if you remember, about midway through the movie, John Wick visits the Continental Hotel, which is a safe haven for assassins and other members of the criminal underworld. And when John arrives, we get introduced to a number of his friends, co-workers, and enemies, and most of these people will factor into the plot in meaningful ways. But there's one person who ends up being a significant nobody, and that's Addie the bartender. And her character intro brings energy, mystery, and emotion, and she comes off as more than just a simple stock character.
Jonathan.
Hey, Abby.
Oh my God. How long has it been?
I've never seen you like this.
Like what?
Vulnerable.
I'm retired.
Not if you're drinking here, you're not.
Compliments of the house.
Now, despite the fact that this scene gives her a pretty strong introduction, we never see her again in this movie or any of its sequels. And this intro sucks because it signals that Addie is more important than she actually is. Her actual purpose in this story is to give John a drink with an important message attached to it. And that's it. Nothing more. And yet, despite her being a stock character, she gets this minute-long intro that's gushing with personality, style, and intrigue. And another issue here is that there's too much dialogue. All she needs to say is a quick, "Hey, how have you been? You want a drink?" That's enough. That's all we need. Them catching up, them having a back and forth, that only hints that there's going to be more to her as a character. It hints that there might be some backstory revealed later on, or there might be a situation where she plays as a sidekick during an important moment in the story. But that never happens, so we don't need to hype her up as someone who's going to come back later. Now, for a good example, let's look at Argyle from Die Hard. And Argyle is, of course, the limo driver who picks up John McClane from the airport. Now, in most stories, cab and limo drivers are nameless stock characters. They might simply crack a joke or ask the main character a question or two, but that's about it. Now, Argyle, on the other hand, he's a fleshed out character with an appropriate intro scene. When we meet him, we learn that it's his first day on the job and that he used to be a cab driver, and through his interactions with John McClane, we see that Argyle is good at reading people and he loves to party. And by the time he drops off McClane at Nakatomi Tower, we get the sense that Argyle is an important character. And sure enough, over the course of the story, he provides comic relief, and he even helps foil the terrorist's escape plan near the end. And this intro works because it establishes a fun, likable comic relief character. And it signals that Argyle will be more than just a limo driver. And it also does double duty. It also humanizes John McClane. At the beginning of the movie, John McClane is this gruff police officer. He doesn't have much to say. Then he meets Argyle, and Argyle starts talking with him, and Argyle gives us insight into McClane's backstory by asking him questions about his marriage and his family. The second type of bad intro is the all-tell, no-show intro. And if you're a writer, you've probably heard the phrase show don't tell. Now, I'm not a fan of this phrase, but what it means is that instead of directly telling the audience about a character's traits, emotions, or history, you should show those things through actions, dialogue, and concrete details. So instead of opening your story by saying Indiana Jones is a brave adventurer, you would say something like, Indiana Jones brushed the tarantulas off his back and continued onward into the ancient temple. And instead of saying something like Marion is bitter that Indy broke up with her years ago, you would express her frustrations through actions and dialogue. You would show her frustration. Now, while showing can be very effective, I hate the phrase show don't tell. And that's because showing and telling are both valuable writing tools. Showing allows you to engage the audience by conveying events as they happen, and telling allows you to quickly convey info that might be difficult to show. Now, it's worth noting that showing is stronger than telling. So if you want to create the strongest possible character intro, you need to show us something engaging, something we can connect with. You can also tell us about your character, but make sure you're at least showing us something. If you tell without showing, your intro will likely come off feeling hollow and unconvincing. For a bad example, let's look at the 2018 movie Gotti. And this is about the real-life gangster John Gotti, and it opens up with a scene where the main character looks right at the camera and tells us about himself.
Let me tell you something. New York is the greatest fucking city in the world. My city. I was a kid in these streets. I started in a fucking gutter, and I made it to the top. This life ends one of two ways, dead or in jail. I did both.
Let me tell you something. This is the worst fucking intro in the world. And it sucks because nothing engaging or dramatic is shown. Instead, there's this static image of Gotti telling the camera that he's this fucking tough guy because he worked his way up from the gutter in the greatest fucking city in the world, and the whole thing sounds like a campaign ad for someone who won't be getting your vote. The overall scene feels forced and uncomfortable, and it doesn't draw you in with emotion, conflict, or anything interesting. Now, for a good example, let's take a look at the dark comedy Thank You for Smoking. This came out in 2005, and this movie is about a big tobacco lobbyist named Nick Naylor. His job is to go around telling people that there's no link between smoking and illnesses like lung disease. Now, you're probably thinking, wow, he sounds like a horrible guy. Why would anyone want to watch this movie? Why would anyone want to spend 90 minutes with a character like that? And the reason why is because the opening scene does a phenomenal job of introducing the character in a way that convinces the audience to empathize with him and envy him. The movie opens up with a talk show host interviewing a boy who was recently diagnosed with cancer. The host then shifts her attention attention to Nick Naylor and explains who he is.
Mr. Naylor is the vice president of the Academy of Tobacco Studies. Now, they are the tobacco industry's main lobby in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Naylor is their chief spokesman.
The crowd boos Nick, who then tells us what it's like to be him. He's honest with us, and he displays self-awareness by admitting that the crowd's hatred for him is justified.
Few people on this planet know what it is to be truly despised. Can you blame them? I earn a living fronting an organization that kills 1,200 human beings a day.
Then he gives us a reason to envy him by explaining his skills.
I get paid to talk. I don't have an MD or law degree. I have a bachelor's in kicking ass and taking names. You know that guy who can pick up any girl? I'm him, on crack.
From there, the talk show resumes, and we see another reason to envy Nick. He's persuasive, and he can spin anything. Within seconds, he performs a Jedi mind trick on the hostile crowd, and he gets them on his side. And then after the talk show ends, we get more reasons to empathize with Nick. We see that he's got a boss who's a pain in the ass, and he's also got a 12-year-old son who he cares about. Though we may not like Nick, we can still relate to him, and this helps draw us into the story. And this scene works because it's an engaging, charismatic intro for an immoral character. And let's face it, this is a guy we should hate, but we don't hate him because he displays self-awareness and tells us interesting details about his life. Then he shows how persuasive he is by swaying a hostile crowd to his side. And the intro also displays his best skills, it conveys a strong sense of style, and it does a great job of balancing showing and telling. Third type of bad intro is the intro parade. And this is when you introduce several characters in repetitive fashion. And during this parade, the plot goes nowhere because of the ongoing introductions, and this scene may involve info dumps and flashbacks. And it can overwhelm the audience because they're being asked to absorb and remember many different characters. And it can also be hard for the audience to get invested in anyone because they just keep piling up. For a bad example, let's look at the 2016 movie Suicide Squad. This movie opens up by introducing us to Deadshot, who's played by Will Smith. He happens to be in jail, and before we get a reason to care about him, we're thrown into Harley Quinn's intro scene. Next, we meet Amanda Waller, a government agent who's trying to assemble a team of super criminals for the sake of national security. And while discussing her plan, Waller reintroduces us to Deadshot and Harley, this time with lengthy flashbacks and on-screen graphics listing out facts about each character. Then, after that, the parade really kicks in. We get introduced to Captain Boomerang, Diablo, Killer Croc, Enchantress, and Colonel Rick Flag, along with other characters who appear within each flashback. The intro parade goes on for a whopping 20 minutes before the movie finally decides that it wants the plot to take over. And this intro sucks because there are too many character introductions at the start. It feels like a series of movie trailers rather than an actual movie. And there's no interaction between the main characters. Everyone is introduced in isolated flashbacks. There's no time to build chemistry. There's also no narrative momentum, tension, or stakes. There's no real plot for 20 minutes, and there's no on-screen threat for us to be concerned about either. It would be nice to see the story open with a concrete reason for why this squad needs to exist in the first place, but we never get that. And then finally, this intro sucks because of flashbacks and info dumps. Instead of allowing us to become curious about these characters and their backstory, the backstory is thrown in our face whether we want it or not. Now, for a good example, let's look at Guardians of the Galaxy. And this movie opens up with a brief prologue that shows Peter Quill on the worst day of his life. He witnesses his mother's death before being abducted by a group of alien smugglers. We then jump ahead 26 years and we see Quill as an adult. This scene establishes him as a stylish treasure hunter who loves classic rock, something that he and his late mother have in common. By the time he steals a valuable orb, the movie has established his character and given us a reason to root for him. Quill is then attacked by people who want the orb, but he manages to escape. And after he escapes, we get introduced to Yondu, who acts as a sort of father figure, and we also get introduced to Ronan, who is the story's main villain. Eventually, a bounty is put on Quill's head, and he tries to go off and sell the orb. And this is when we meet two of our main characters, Rocket and Groot. They're both bounty hunters trying to track him down, and we also meet an assassin named Gamora, who snatches the orb away from Quill. A battle then ensues between the four main characters, and it ends with them being captured by police. And shortly after, we get a formal introduction to the characters in a police lineup scene. And this is an info dump, but it's brief, humorous, and it feels natural within the context of the movie. And that right there wraps up the first 20 minutes of the movie, which is loaded with excitement, humor, and character interaction. And this intro works because it firmly grounds us in Quill's character. The heartbreaking prologue makes us sympathize with him, and then the stylish adult intro makes us love the guy. Once we're interested, we can't wait to see how he'll interact with everyone he encounters. And there's also narrative momentum. There's mystery, there's stakes. Once Quill is introduced, he takes a series of actions that force the other characters to act. This gets the plot rolling, and it makes character introductions necessary. And the intros involve conflict, drama, mystery, humor, consequences, and best of all, character interaction. And this creates excitement, and it gets us curious about the character's backstory, which is revealed later on in the movie. And the fourth type of bad intro is the blown opportunity. Remember those things I talked about at the beginning of the video about what makes a good character introduction? Usually you want to build an emotional connection to the character, you want to show us what their daily life is like, and you want to give us something to engage with, something that intrigues us and makes us want to spend time with the character. Ideally, you want to hit on these points, and if you don't, your intro scene could fall flat. For a bad example, let's take a look at Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars Attack of the Clones. And this movie opens up with high stakes and explosive action. Right off the bat, Padme is nearly assassinated, and the Jedi Council decides to place her under the protection of Obi-Wan Kenobi and his apprentice Anakin Skywalker, who has a childhood crush on Padme. Now, Anakin is of course the main character, and though we met him in the previous movie, he needs a proper introduction here because this is the first time we see him as an adult. A strong intro scene might introduce him by showing his daily life as a Jedi and showing his potential to turn to the dark side. Maybe he and Obi-Wan are on a dangerous mission together, and Anakin then threatens to cross a line before Obi-Wan talks some sense into him. A scene like that could really establish the character in an engaging, memorable way. But instead, what we get is Anakin and Obi-Wan riding an elevator together. They exchange some poorly written dialogue until the elevator stops, and Anakin sees Padme for the first time in 10 years. He pays her an awkward compliment, gets shut down, and then everyone discusses how they plan to protect her. Obi-Wan wants to follow the Council's orders and simply watch over her, but Anakin challenges his master and insists they should personally investigate the assassination attempt. Now this intro sucks because first of all, we get no sense of Anakin's daily life as a Jedi. We don't get to experience any exciting adventures, we don't take part in any mysterious training sessions, we don't even see what he's good at or what he struggles with. All we get is that elevator ride. And that elevator scene leaves a brutally awkward first impression. There's no energy, there's no charisma, there's just two guys standing around exchanging bad dialogue. And I get that they want to show that Anakin is nervous about seeing Padme, but nervous characters don't have to be this hard to watch. Some stronger dialogue and better chemistry between him and Obi-Wan could have made this intro more engaging. And another problem with this scene is that it blew an opportunity to foreshadow Anakin's turn to the dark side. They could have introduced him in a scenario where he's tempted to give in to his character flaws, his fear, his anger, but we don't get a strong impression of that here. We do see his emotions spill over and control him when he argues with Obi-Wan, but it lacks impact. And that's the biggest problem here, because this entire intro lacks impact. There's no signature moment that brings Anakin to life, and he feels like a generic teenager rather than someone who's been training as a Jedi for the past decade. Now for a good example, let's look at the 2022 movie The Batman. And this movie actually opens up in a similar way to Attack of the Clones. You have a political figure being assassinated by a mysterious killer, and then the hero gets called in to help. But there's a key difference here, and it's that we get to see Batman's daily life before he arrives at the crime scene. First off, there's a voiceover that tells us how he views the city and how he's struggling to keep criminals under control. Then we see him make a dramatic entrance. He sneaks up on a bunch of criminals and he intimidates them.
The hell are you supposed to be?
I'm vengeance.
And once he finishes pummeling these criminals, he visits the site of the murder and he shows off his detective skills. And this intro works because we get a clear sense of Batman's daily life. We engage with the character and we feel like we're right there with him. And there's a signature moment here. Batman enters in style and he intimidates a bunch of dangerous criminals. He shows that he's at the top of the food chain here. And his flaw is on display, and that's the fact that he's preoccupied with vengeance. He even refers to himself as vengeance. And one last reason why this works, it's a dynamic introduction. We see him not only as a powerful enforcer, but also as a master detective. Brains and brawn. He can beat you up in the streets, or he can track you down using his detective skills. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: what are some of the best and worst intro scenes that you've come across in stories? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of either one of my books and be sure to leave reviews on Amazon. Bad Parts is great if you like small town horror. It's about people trading away their sick and injured body parts in order to get healthy again. And then Entry Wounds is great if you like thrillers. It's about a guy who picks up a haunted gun and he can't put it down till he kills 6 people with it. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, like, share, and subscribe. And as always, remember to keep on writing.